Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning into Maybe Muslim, a podcast that aims to define and redefine the idea of being an Indian, a Muslim, and everything in between. I am Mariam Heather, producer and host of the podcast, and I'm joined by Dr. Ghazala Jamil, assistant professor at the Center for the Study of Law and Governance, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Prior to joining JNU, Ghazala has taught at the Department of Social Work, University of Delhi, and School of Planning and Architecture, and has over 10 years of experience of working within India's development sector. She is the author of Accumulation by Segregation and Muslim Women Speak. Her latest book, titled Women in Social Change Visions, Struggles, and Persisting Concerns, is an edited volume on women's rights in India, out in 2021. Apart from several book chapters and journal articles, her writings have appeared in The Wire, Outlook, The Telegraph, Hindustan Times, and The Indian Express. In this conversation, Ghazala and I discuss Muslim feminism in India and explore its history, evolution, and the ways in which it is bolstering mainstream feminist discourse. Her political approach towards this subject has incorporated contemporary realities faced by Indian Muslim women, including communalism, caste politics, patriarchy, Hindu-Muslim relationship, and the anti-Muslim violence in post-independent India. Through her own research, experiences, and scholarly investigation, Ghazala has contributed towards a deeper understanding of what it means to be a Muslim woman and a feminist. This enriching conversation is only a window to her research, thinking, and scholarship, and you can read more about her work through Maybe Muslim's website, mainbhimuslim.com. Hi, Ghazala. Thanks so much for taking the time and welcome to Maybe Muslim podcast.
Hi, Mariam. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
It is such a pleasure actually to speak to you today. It's a lovely morning, and I have been reading your work, and I've also been following some of the work you have been, writing about in the scholarly, research space. And when I did actually get a chance to read your book, Muslim Women Speak, it just literally spurred me to speak to you in person, talk to you about what is the understanding of Muslim feminist discourse within the mainstream, Indian feminism discourse that we are in. And I would love to hear more from the way that you have approached this subject and the way you have used your research to understand it better.
Thank you so much for your kind words. I think for any author, the best thing is for readers to engage with the work and do it critically also, so that one also learns from it. So this book is actually a few years old now. It's published in 2018. And I think since then I've had like numerous conversations with feminists of all kinds and young women in India, a lot of journalists, etc. And I have come to reflect upon what the findings or what the theoretical propositions that I put forward in this work, which basically reached out to hundreds of Muslim young women. I have also come to realize, what are the shortcomings, how I could have done it better. So it's nice to have a conversation even few years since the publication, and of course, over a decade since the research actually was done. So it's been a long time, but it's the kind of research engagement with young Muslim women, which every time you revisit it, you learn something new. And it's true certainly for all the researchers who were involved. So this was a large project. Lot of researchers were involved in doing this. So I did conceptualize it and I did design it, and eventually all the data analysis and writing was done by me, but the workshops themselves were conducted by many other Muslim researchers who worked with me on this project. So throughout the process of actually doing this research with this team of researchers, most of whom were Muslim women, but there were several others as well. I learned so much about what it means to be a Muslim woman and a feminist. While one is reviewing literature, and there was at that point of time, in 2009, 10, 11, which is when the most intensive work on this study happened. So there was very nascent literature on Indian Muslim feminists. There were a couple of articles which I could, lay my hands on. There's some writing by Sylvia Vartok. I can think of Nida Kirmani, who had done some work on this, very good article. So there was, that kind of work. But for me personally, I think Muslim feminism, or pushing the articulation of a Muslim feminism in India, meant that it was a feminism which was alive to the political realities of Muslims in India. The theological questions, of course, also informed it, but it was for me not a largely theological project. It was not a religious quest. It's very political for me. So the question of communalism in India and the entire communal history in India, the Hindu-Muslim relationship, formation of Indian state, and all the violence, which is often called communal violence, but I would say that post-independent India, a lot of it is targeted anti-Muslim violence rather than spontaneous, right? So this whole thing about socioeconomic discrimination, communal violence, the electoral politics, all of this informs what I understand of Muslim feminism as practiced by Muslim women in India.
Yeah, in so many ways, you were covering some of the points I was thinking as well. And again, you're very right that since the time early, I would say 2009, 10, it was very nascent. However, now we are in a space where the idea of Muslim feminist in India is becoming more and more visible in so many ways. And it is becoming pertinent to have that conversation as a larger conversation. It's not limited to Muslims in India. It's becoming, what is the mainstream conversation around what it means to be a feminist, what it means to be a woman. With regard to that, what have been some of the changes, or in a way, like the ways that conversation has evolved, whether it's through the media, whether it's through literature?
I would say that at a certain point of time there was even let's say 20 years ago, when I was a young college going student, etc. Um, uh, and I'm a social worker by training, so I worked in development sector prior to joining academics. I worked in NGOs uh, for 10 years, doing different kinds of consultancies and working in grassroots movements. So I had been, in conversation with the civil society in India, or at least I had, known about largely what kind of discourses were there. And there was a lot of discourse about, let's say, for example, rights of other power minorities in India, especially caste minorities, scheduled caste, scheduled tribes. Of course, within the feminist movement, the bigger women question in India, the patriarchy of Indian society in different communities. So that was there. But I think, the Muslim women's question was largely caught in a few, stereotypical tropes about impact of Islamic so-called backwardness, fundamentalism, etc., and the gender question. So the stereotypes about that, and nobody really knew. I mean, empirically, what were the realities of Muslim women or their articulation, autonomous articulation was not really recognized in the public sphere. So if you look at 2006, when the Sachar Committee report came, Sachar Committee itself did not have a woman member on it, and it hardly paid any attention to the gender question. So that was really the situation. And if you said something like, if you used a term like Muslim feminism, uh, people would think that it's an oxymoron, that the terms couldn't really come together. And the whole discourse about Muslim women was in India, but elsewhere also, it's, I mean, quite informed and propped up by the global discourse also, that Muslim women are merely victims of Islam and Muslim men and patriarchy within Islam. So I think in the last 10 or so years, that situation has, changed drastically. In the last 4 or 5 years, I think we've made so much progress because there was, because of an unfortunate development in the polity in India, there also was a silver lining to the dark cloud, that there was a political opportunity for a certain kind of articulation to come. So I think there is, even today, there's a little bit of a misrepresentation that because of the CA movement was somehow something external which politicized Muslim women, and then they it kind of taught them or educated them to political realities and a certain kind of articulation. However, my point of view, and I've spoken to many young and I must say older, senior to me Muslim women who have participated in these protests across India, which proves to me without any doubt as a researcher that it's not that the movement itself taught them something, but because they knew a few things about their own realities, therefore the movement itself, could come into being. And they forced, if I were to use the framing that I've used in my book, that they forced the larger society to listen to their articulation. So it's not that they didn't have a voice. They had a voice. They had an understanding. They had been discussing. They had been critiquing the politics, but there was no recognition of that understanding. And what the anti-CA NRC movement did was that in public sphere, the rest of constituents of the public sphere, all the other participants in civil society in India, were forced to sit up and listen to Muslim women. Of course, they were dazzled and they were like, a little surprised by it. In that sense, it was unprecedented, but it's not that they were, that it was a bolt in the pan and suddenly there was political awakening. That is a kind of misrepresentation that I've heard a lot of young Muslim women who are working scholars, who are working on related subjects, feel resentful for this kind of representation.
Yeah, it has to be said that, and then I often think about it in my own personal spaces as well. Even, the understanding of why MBM as a project started is these conversations were always there. As a Muslim woman, I was always negotiating my stand in the larger society. I was always figuring out how do I represent myself. I was always very acutely aware of my religious belonging, of my social belonging. It's only that when this became, and this is something I would, refer to my former co-host, she said it, that when it came to a point where if you don't talk about it now, in a space which is larger than what you were, occupying earlier, it will be very easy for people to not know that you exist, because there is this initiative to make sure that your identity is threatened, your citizenship is at stake. And it was really like that point where we all started going back to our own, upbringings, and just realizing that that has always been there. We are always talking about who we are as Muslim women, what is our place in the society, how are we taking space in the society. Now that somebody is saying, oh, Muslim women are the ones who are taking their things in their own hands, like we've always been taking things in our own hands. We've always been trying to understand that part. And it's taking me back to some of the instances, and also like the way in your book Muslim Women Speak, you have mentioned how when you were researching different aspects, and also different categories of Muslim women, whether in different states of India, what were your experiences, for how did they figure out their place in the society they came from, whether they were women from Maharashtra and Mumbai, women from Gujarat. Can you like share some experiences of how, while you were doing this research along with your team, what were some of the revelations of the Indian Muslim woman that you had, even as a researcher and a scholar?
Um, I was actually hired as a consultant by a civil society organization to do this research. And the broad brief was that they wanted a study to ascertain what are the aspirations of young Muslim women in India. And interestingly, I've described in the book how we kind of came to an agreement about what kind of methodologies that we used, and that these would be more descriptive, more what I call feminist methods, which wouldn't be only uh, averaging and establishing correlations, etc. So, not really statistical methods, but methods which would capture voices of the participants. So right at the beginning, when we started to, there was a workshop where I was working with the team of researchers who would be conducting these workshops. So there were workshops all across India in many locations. So I couldn't have possibly done all those workshops myself. So there was a team of researchers, and I was doing this, training of trainers sort of thing.
Mm.
And that was also supposed to be experiential. So we did the same exercises with this group of trainers. And these were mostly, very experienced community-based organization leaders and workers who were working at the grassroots. So what happened after the workshop was that they actually said that nobody had ever asked us what our aspirations are. So it was really refreshing to actually tell somebody what our aspirations are, and for the older women, to also take a stock of how many of those aspirations they had actually achieved or are on their way of achieving. And just this kind of self exploration was something that they really found refreshing. But the other thing that they also said, later when we met, after most of them had conducted one or two workshops, we met once again as a group. And something that really, struck me is that as researchers, we often theoretically we talk about which methods are more, ethical, which methods would actually amount to the subjects of a research also getting empowered in the process of research. So, what will happen to the research once it's written, once it's disseminated? People have read it. That's another thing. But what do participants in the research get from it? And at least for the, this uh, team of researchers who were working with me, they said, sometimes as women, we were made to feel that our own experiences were not really valuable, and we ourselves thought that we've come through so many difficulties, there's so many struggles, and you kind of all the struggles often make us feel like our lives are have no greater meaning. Sometimes, in worst cases, you are also made to feel worthless. And they said that because they had those experiences, and sometimes, in the workshops, the girls were really overcome by their own experiences of violence, of discrimination in society, of being treated as if they were nobody, humiliation in public spaces, workspaces, domestic violence, not to forget that, all of that. So sometimes when you couldn't say something in a very articulate way in so many words, just that shared experience meant that the research was able to capture it. Like they felt that it had been communicated and that it had been understood, and
Hmm.
somebody had thought it important to record it somewhere, right? So just participating in those exercises made them feel very empowered. So I was quite, I have myself been, quite empowered by the experience of having done this, despite the fact that there are so many flaws. And as I, jokingly say sometimes that this is like juvenilia, something, one of the first like large scale projects that I
Hmm.
did. So I know what I could have done better. But despite all the flaws that it has, I think it was very important for me that those voices that we managed to capture as a group,
Hmm.
young women and what they said, that it was, I had to put it out. And as I, also shared elsewhere, that the publication process itself was quite challenging for me. And, it had a lot of hiccups. It took a lot of time for me to do that. I just couldn't, had it been, just something that I'd sat down in my study and written as an opinion or a self reflection kind of piece, then I might have actually given up. I
Hmm.
just couldn't bring myself to give up on the fact that so many women had thought the process to be important enough and invested in it, and then nobody would ever get to read it. So, that was nice, and yeah, I mean, there's so many other things that one learned, but yeah, we can speak about it, in course of our conversation.
Yeah, just listening to you, Ghazala, made me, I mean, it was bringing a smile to my face, because um, I could only imagine like the feeling and the, in a sense, like, um, I would say like, I mean, obviously there was a responsibility, like you felt you were responsible now to really bring their voices because they had taken the time, they had really put themselves out there. And then along with that, there was a sense of respite in me that, we have people like you who are investing their time and energies into this understanding that everyone's experiences matter. There is no, like you were mentioning earlier, that some of them thought their experiences were not valuable, and that's a very that's very sad reality, which I feel like a lot of women, Muslim and otherwise as well, might also feel, that they don't think that it is worth sharing or it is worth considering, but it has an impact on how they live their lives. You know. So thank you so much. I mean, that was really empowering to even listen to. And I think what I really want to also approach on today's conversation is it's something which we discussed a bit earlier, is understanding like within when we talk about Muslim women in India, there is of course a liberal class of Muslim feminists who would be called like the old guard, who had been part of the larger feminist discourse, ever in a post-independent India. Um, However, as things evolve and as more voices join and as more issues and more, I would say, like cracks in the larger scheme of what feminism really means emerge, like whose voice matters and how does one offer, how does one use the platform they have? How does one expand that platform for other voices to shape that conversation as well? Um, what are your thoughts on that? Like, how do you think this diversity of the Muslim feminist voices is taking shape in the country today, and what more can be done to make it just to bring it out in a more, I would say, equitable manner.
So, I mean, when I started this research, as I mentioned, I was reading Sylvia Wharton, Nida Kirmani. There's another article which I remember now, Nadia Schneider, talking about Muslim feminists or feminist Muslim women's organizations in India and so on. And one of the things that really struck me as reflective of my own experience of being in civil society is that in the development sector slash civil society slash and the subset of women's rights organizations within that, there was this whole discourse about Muslim women as a victim, and mostly their issues were related to personal law. And I won't waste time to repeat that. We all know, we're all familiar with that discourse. Now, women, Muslim women who were feminists at that point, I think, were really invested into the liberal feminist discourse. And part of their being feminist was to also, what in hindsight we can call, of course, at that point of time, that was not the frame that was used to critique it. But now we can, I think, critique it from the framework of Mahmood Mamdani's Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. So there was this whole thing about, there was a certain kind of Muslim feminist who was a feminist because there was a rejection of Islam, rejection of Islam as a patently patriarchal religion. There was little understanding of or little empathy. I think, let me put it that way. There was little empathy about the political realities of the Muslim community in India and their own experiences. I've heard anecdotal evidence, which unfortunately I haven't yet written about, but there were many instances when within the Muslim community, they actually did not really have a standing. So outside the Muslim community, they were the representatives of Muslims, the token Muslim, so to say. They were talking about Muslims, but in a way which never empathized with the Muslim situation. It always scolded Muslim, for their, inability to come up to a certain standards of how one should behave in a modern liberal democracy that India is supposedly supposed to be. Right. So it was always, that the Muslim community itself received that kind of treatment from all the Muslim voices in the public sphere. And that's hardly something which can inspire a community into becoming better. And there was always, there was other kind of Muslim leadership, which was not seen obviously as liberal, because they were too invested into the religious discourse. They were not using the political discourse so much. And then there's the whole question of how you appear. So if you appear visibly as a certain kind of Muslim who puts on a certain kind of attire, and all the sartorial choices that Muslim men and women make, that made them always this thing that they were not really interested in modern liberal democracy. And in the feminist circuit, I think a lot of changes were happening in any case, in the late 70s and 80s in the larger feminist circle, vis-a-vis feminists' relationship with the Indian state, where until 70s there was this paternalistic relationship where we thought, well, now we are a free country and the Indian state is invested and is responsible for the welfare of Indian people, and therefore it would take care of the welfare of Indian women and improve their or ameliorate their situation, which of course was not happening. There was violence against women by state and state agencies, etc., in public sphere. So in any case, women's movement was into this churn where they were evaluating, re-evaluating their relationship with state, and then it was not collaborative, paternalistic kind of thing. Then onwards, and there were several confrontations. However, within that, Muslim women were still patronized. They were still told that these are your issues, and there wasn't any articulation truly of Muslim women to actually state what their issues were. So this kind of mirrors the history of, let's say, in the West, the mainstream feminist movement or women's rights movement actually coming out of the struggles of Black people, but not really recognizing. So, in the same way, the Indian history, where let's say a lot of women rights activists in late colonial period were Muslim women, and whether you look at the early Indian suffragettes who were talking about voting rights, you look at print cultures in India, even in politics, there were a lot of Muslim women who were participating in public cultures, whether political or cultural, artistic, etc. And the largely disruptive and catastrophic events such as the partition of India, with its entire, sort of baggage of communal politics, I think devastated Muslim women activists' agency in India, and its history was kind of erased from India's quick recall public memory, right? So everybody forgot that Muslim women editors, Muslim women writers, Muslim women politicians, of course they were elite, similar to as there were, elite Hindu women who were mostly in public sphere. It was obviously not as democratic as it can be today. So yes, time also changes many other things, but it is the history of those Muslim women and their political, cultural activism has been forgotten. And I think for me, as a researcher, as a scholar, as a Muslim feminist today in India, the part of the struggle is also to, and that's a very feminist project, to sort of recover those histories and remember them. And obviously, so many of us are doing that today in India, where we are trying to recover those histories, create new histories, and assert that Muslim women have had this understanding, and they have, in their own way, also been feminist, even when some of them are not comfortable using the tag of feminist. So there is disagreement about women's autonomy and how to go about becoming more autonomous. Whether you want to call it a feminist, exercise, or you want to call it by a different name because of the history of interaction with the mainstream feminism in India in the last few decades. So there's a lot of that churning happening today. And I think in the last few years have been quite phenomenal, where I personally have seen that a lot of, older feminists, of generation before my own, are sitting up and paying attention. They want to listen, they want to hear, And they have been in the past few years through the anti-CA movement, through Muslim women's articulation on issues of great importance to the constitutional culture in India. So this is not just about Muslim, politics or Muslim positioning, but the larger questions of what does democracy, liberalism, secularism, equality, rights, belonging, those kind of issues. So I think the feminist movement in India largely is richer for Muslim women's articulation, for engaging with it. And I believe that we have contributed a lot to deepening of feminist movement in India. And I think people are sitting up and listening and learning from it.
Thanks for sharing that, Ghazala. I think a lot of what you said was helping me connect a lot of dots as I read a lot of, mainstream liberal feminists or the readings of scholars and researchers and activists across the globe. And you're very right in saying that the Muslim feminism discourse is only richening the larger feminism space in India. And I'm ever so grateful that we're having this conversation in this manner. There is one thing that you mentioned in the book, and I'm not, I believe that this is something which it requires like a more, I would say, exploration, but I would like to hear from you. There was one part where you mentioned that the common experience of communal discrimination along with violence or the anticipation of violence binds Muslim women and Muslim men together more strongly than the common experience of patriarchy binds Hindu women and Muslim women. And in light of that, I want to kind of, open this bit of our conversation. That do you think there's an understanding that as a community and the society evolves and grows, as new instances arise, this kind of this statement that you have mentioned gets more and more open to exploration with regard to patriarchy, Islamophobia, and in a way we can kind of see that there's a shifting of sands within this statement itself. Like there will be a time where there can be more collaboration across different feminist discourses to fight the larger forces of Islamophobia, to fight the larger forces of patriarchy.
Yeah, the thing is that there is a in the academia and in the academic feminist literature, the idea of feminism, how we understand what constitutes feminist movement, is much more nuanced and much more strong. There are a lot of differing voices within it. There are a lot of quarrels, disagreements, and agreement to disagree. However, in the popular version of or let me call it an NGOized version of the feminist movement, which is where the larger numbers are, where you have to simplify a lot of things and just gesture at them for most of the women to get to understand that. Now, the thing is that this NGOize feminist movement in India or the feminist spaces in India are actually spaces where this popular understanding of feminism or let me say, put it differently, popular understanding of what patriarchy is that there are men and there are women, and men are more powerful than women, and men constitute an oppressing class, and all the women as oppressed are bound together by a certain sisterhood, if you must. Now, that's a very easy way to articulate it. It will ring bells with almost all women who live in patriarchal societies. So it's good for as a broad framing for mobilization of women's agency and their action within the movement. However, as women who come from certain other privileged locations, So in India, it being a Hindu majority country where there is a long history of majoritarianism also in post-independent India, and women who are coming from upper caste Hindu backgrounds, it's easy for them to insist on this kind of sisterhood from their experience. However, women who are coming from marginalized backgrounds also realize that not all men are equally powerful, right? So, a poor woman would understand how. There is state agencies violence on poor men as well. They don't come across to them as, of course, they in a patriarchal setup they have certain powers over women within their limited circuit, but they're also not as powerful as other men that you see, other powerful men that you see. So from a marginalized point of view, you see that. And men and women do not constitute such different sections in society that can be segregated. Like there is so much, my other work is on segregation, residential segregation, or based on communal, fault lines. One studies about caste segregation, etc. Now, gender relationship do not, afford such spatial distancing from the other, the big O other, right? And our reproductive realities also mean that we are talking about our sons, our brothers, our fathers, uncles, etc., etc. And I think for Muslim women, seeing state violence on the bodies of Muslim men, a lot of that violence is also, as we realize today, in the wake of the post anti-CA movement. All the men who are in jails, and those who have died as a result of excesses of police, the way houses are being bulldozed, etc. It impacts families. So yes, there is a gendered, component to it. There is a sexualized reality of that violence, which impacts men and women differently, but it impacts both of them. And sexual violence, state violence, excesses on Muslim men's body is also a stark reality. So I think that's something that nuances the already existing understanding that feminism is not just about women's issues. Feminism is a challenge to a certain kind of power dynamics which oppresses even men, right? So patriarchy is something that doesn't give all season pass to all men. It gives more power to certain kind of men and not to the others. So I think what Muslim women's rights discourse and Muslim feminism is also successful in doing. It's just the beginning, but when I'm saying it's deepening feminist cultures in India or feminist understanding in India, this is what I also mean, that feminism is beyond this idea that men oppress women and all women are. So we're looking at a more nuanced critique of how patriarchal power functions within society and within state and its institutions. And that's one reason why I think feminists other than Muslim feminists are also interested in this discourse and they are engaging with it. Hijab, debate, for example, is one such wonderful example of how it has deepened the whole critique of the idea that women's autonomy and women's liberation should be articulated only in Western liberal terms, and there are no other forms of autonomy which women themselves would like to exercise.
Yeah. I mean, I'm at a loss of words actually, because everything that you've said is helping articulate. I mean, you've articulated it so well, and I do hope that with work like yours and with the way that you're articulating and bringing it out through different mediums, whether it's to writing, whether it's to your public speaking, this nuanced understanding percolates deeper within the larger conversations, within the more, like you said, popular conversations, the NGOized conversations as well. And as a final question for our conversation, I wanted to ask you, like, if you look at the next decade of this movement of sorts within the larger Indian feminist space, like um, that along with the Muslim feminists, like where do you see this discourse? What kind of topics, what kind of areas of conversation, negotiation, exploration do you see the discourse taking its shape and form?
That's a really tough question. I don't know. I don't know if I should venture to look into future and start predicting what will happen. As it is, today, where we stand today in India, I think this future, it's kind of scary to look into future because one doesn't want to hope too much because of the fear that those hopes will be dashed very badly and violently. But also that, it's impossible to go on without, keeping the hope open. But I think, just from my limited experience of being a university teacher and trying to speak to activists and scholars from younger generations, I think these generational dialogues are really richening our understanding of what is and what can be. My generation is kind of in between generation of scholar activists who are, I mean, I feel maybe I'm being very grandiose about it, but I feel that I have a responsibility to also mediate between the two generations. So sometimes the most senior ones are still caught into the frames that they used to cope with the realities of post-partition India and the Muslim positioning, in post-partition India, with all the accompanying burden of that history. So I I don't view them very harshly, although I do have these discussions with them. But I do understand that they came from a situation which was very difficult for a community to negotiate and for them to come up with framings as to how to do this. But having said that, a lot of them find it very difficult even today to understand the framings that younger people use to articulate, to understand, to respond to the existing Indian realities. And there is a gap between these two understandings. Uh, so I feel that we will be richer if we really listen to the younger generation. And I do try to, a lot of what I'm saying, I have learned from my students. And a lot of them have taken much greater risk than my generation ever did, even today, because in the late 90s, when we were in the university, the future looked really bright. And Jamia, where I studied, for example, there were many new professional courses. It seemed that amongst Muslim there was a change at that point of time, where in my earlier generation, a majority would say, well, what do you get if you get educated? There are no jobs for you. But there was, there in the liberalized economy, there was also a sense of opening of certain spaces which otherwise were not there. So on one hand, this was happening, but on the other hand, there was also another kind of democratization of public education and university system where you were seeing a lot more Muslim students coming up. I myself, went back to university, got myself a PhD, etc. Around that time, when the doors of universities open a little wider for Muslim scholars coming from non-elite backgrounds and vis-a-vis the OBC reservations, for example, that was one. So that generation, this kind of democratization was it had a huge impact on Muslim articulation, on Muslim scholarship, on students coming from marginalized backgrounds who had a better understanding, I would say, who were not really invested in this good Muslim, bad Muslim, which even today, when I talk to Muslim scholars who come from established elite families, they're still invested in that. They're still trying to, and although they are being called out and they are also, questioning themselves, there is a lot of, but by and large, that's what was happening. But I think, idealism is it's just heartening that, it's all time high. Young people are taking these positions with at great personal risks and sacrifices. That's for all of us to see, what kind of sacrifices they're making at the cost of their own personal liberty, literally, and at the cost of having some kind of cushy, future somewhere, go abroad, get these kind of degrees and so on. So a lot of people are doing that. And I think for Muslim feminist women, for insisting that that in public sphere their voices should continue to be heard. For example, you yourself who's coming up with all kinds of, like, young people who are coming up with different kinds of medium of engagement, where not only they are saying what they want to say and pushing the limits of discourses on Muslims in India, but also facilitating other voices, providing them space to engage. So there's, through social media, through technology, there is also another wave of democratization of public sphere that is happening. And although with every democratization, there is always, that's the paradox of democracy, that democratic methods are always mandated to make space for anti-democratic expressions as well. So there is trolling and there is harassment, which is also facilitated by technology. And of course, there is always, you can never get away from it, but there's always the looming power of modern nation state on one hand, capitalism on the other hand, now enabled and empowered like ever more by this technology itself. So I guess as a feminist, I guess the conflict goes on. The debate becomes more nuanced. We learn more things, and hopefully, better realities will come to be. But we don't know. As I said, as I began this answer, it's very scary to be too hopeful.
Thank you so much, Ghazala. I'm again, like, I just feel so fortunate that I've been able to have this conversation with you. There's so much to unpack in the last 1 hour that we spoke, and I would really love to continue, be invested in your work, in your research, in everything that you're doing in the public space, and allowing more and more people to learn from the way that you're bringing this nuance, this intersectional, very I would say empathy-driven approach to larger masses. And I do hope that this conversation reaches far and wide. So thank you so much, Ghazala, for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for this amazing opportunity and just great questions that made me think about all these issues.